everybody. Welcome to Books and Bridges, a Humanities Institute of Ideas and Conversation. As part of our series on ethical schools of thought, tonight will be a study in the scales of influence, how a single man and his collection of writings won over governments, cultures, and minds across East Asia for centuries and brought order to the individual heart. We are fortunate to have Krishnan Venkatesh as our guest. Mr. Venkatesh has taught at St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico for more than 30 years and helped shape its Eastern Classics graduate program. He has served as Dean of Graduate Studies and is the author of Do You Know Who You Are? Reading the Buddha's Discourses, and Frodo's Wound, Why the Lord of the Rings is a Great Book. Venkatesh studied English literature at Magdalen College, Cambridge. He researched Shakespeare at the University of Munster in Germany and taught literature and philosophy at Shanxi University in China. Mr. Venkatesh, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me again, Nathan.
So tell us about Confucius. What did he write? How did he influence his society?
Okay.
What are your thoughts? It's a big topic.
Last one's a big question. So Confucius probably lived around 500 BC, so give or take 30, 40 years on either side. And he lived in a very turbulent time, warring time between different states. And in fact, China had been experiencing, what became China, right? It wasn't China yet. So what became China was a bunch of warring feudal states that had been warring for over 1,500 years before. So if you read the great book Records of the Historian by Sima Qian, which is an amazing book, another one to talk about at a future date. It's the 1,500 years before Confucius is it's a litany of war and bloodshed, power struggles, and with a few bright lights. But if you're going to imagine Confucius, what he inherited, it would be like 1,500 years of civil war, right? So if you think that the Civil War is the American trauma, then Confucius would have been nurtured in the womb of trauma of 1,500 years of violent history that seemed to cycle between fragile good periods and mostly terrible bad periods, right? That went on for a long time. So that was what he was faced with, and one might say that so were Greek philosophers, so were Plato and Aristotle. There was a lot of political turbulence, a lot of violence and upset. And so in a way, the Confucian project is how do we change and how do we make another kind of human being that will stop all this, that will enable a better life, a life for human beings to become better, right? So in a way, what Confucius had to do was reinvent or re-envision what a human being was and articulate a new possibility, right? Because otherwise, how do you get out of this perpetual cycle of violent power struggle? So that was what he was responding to, I think, historically. And one might say that he was an idealist. He believed in human possibilities. And on the other hand, he took great pains to establish the kind of person he was creating, as it were, inventing, to establish that on great kings of the past, ancient sage kings, those people who actually lived, had these qualities. So Confucius kind of took history and the kinds of people he found in history and sculpted and molded them to present a picture, a pretty complex picture of a kind of person called the Junzi, right? Junzi, sometimes translated the gentleman, the Confucian gentleman, or superior man, and this ethical ideal differed from, say, the Greek ethical ideal, in that there was nothing warlike about this. It's not necessarily a warrior, but was kind of we'd see him as a well-adjusted human being with certain sensitivity to human relations, a capacity for love, loyalty, responsibility, reliability, and cultural depth and refinement. You know, a kind of like model Chinese person that you might think of today. You know, soft-spoken, not brash, not simple-minded, has finesse, has nuance, and you see this, you know, in Chinese films. If you know, actually, it's an East Asian type, I think, an East Asian ideal type of man, right? And also, but you know, of woman too. So not at all like the brash Homeric warrior, not at all like the kind of excessive, hard-nosed Athenian male, right? It's not like that. So much of his work was to create a picture of how to live based on creating a picture of what a human being could be, which was based on study of what he thought, you know, was actual people and not just myths. So it started from there, and Confucius is cryptic. He's very terse. So there's a lot in his work that's open to interpretation, and so you have different schools of interpretation of Confucianism, of which we'll get into. But for about the first 200 or 300 years after Confucius, after he died, his work was scorned by practical politicians, by statesmen, by social thinkers, you know, as impossibly naive and idealistic, right? So it took, when the Qin dynasty came to power, which was 3rd century BC, and Qin dynasty was the one that first unified China, kind of like made China kind of unified nation state. The Qin were the ones who built the Great Wall, had the terracotta warriors in Xi'an, you know, built the great palaces. And during the Qin dynasty, there were, say, 100 different schools going on, of which Confucianism was one. And the Qin dynasty banned all but one school, the legalists, had all the books burned, including the Confucian classics. And so it took a while for Confucianism to take on, not necessarily as a political philosophy, but as but as a social philosophy. Many disagreed with him for hundreds of years after, and so you wouldn't say that he's influential because the whole of East Asia united behind his vision, because that just wasn't true. You know, it took a long time. Yeah, he's most famous for this book, the Analects. I affectionately call it the Analects, and it's a collection of sayings. He wrote a number of books were attributed to him. He wrote one called the Great Learning, Doctrine of the Mean. The I Ching is attributed to him, and various history books, the Book of Documents. He collected some of the writings that were available at his time and he made books into them, like the Book of Odes, the Book of Rites, like this. So major classics were attributed to him, but the most famous of his books is the Analects, which is the one that you will find in most bookstores.
So it seems to me like he is very much starting from the ground up. He realizes the connection between, the larger forces of society, government, war, and the individual, and how those scales of matters of the state and matters of the heart, that those are connected and they're part of the same, maybe spectrum, you could even say. It seems to me like that's his approach. He takes the long term. He's not about quick fixes, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and perhaps one of the things that people found idealistic about him was that he saw the small scale, the familial, the individual, the personal, as being continuous with a larger scale, the realm of politics. Just in contrast, another thinker might say that there's no continuity between those two. The virtues of a family man, like love, loyalty, fondness for kids, love of protecting people, that they might have no place in a statesman, right? A statesman has to be willing to wage war, to kill people, to manipulate his way to power, to manipulate in order to stay in power, like that. So say like a Machiavelli would say, like, the virtues of a politician cannot be the same as the virtues of an ordinary person. Not only Machiavelli, but other Chinese thinkers might say that. But for Confucius, the kinds of virtues that you develop by being a good human being on the family level, on the personal level, says those are what make you into a good statesman, right? And of which, then his realistic rivals will say, ho, 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 find me an example. Yeah.
So give us a sense of the essence of his ethical thought and how it would relate to an individual's life.
Okay, so I'm going to pull out. So Confucius, I think, has two threads that relate to each other in a complex and interesting way, and those two threads get amplified by two of his students in subsequent generations. So two students from now. So I have before me three books. One is the Analects, and one is Mencius, the book of Mencius, which I think he was 3 generations down from Confucius. And the other one is Shunze. It's in this book by translation Burton Watson. So Shunze, big blue book. Shunze is the HSUN. Z just means master, right? So Master Shun, XUN, is another way of seeing it. So Mencius, right? And by the way, the shus part of Mencius and Confucius, they why do they have Latin sounding names when all the others have z at the end? So like Lao Tzu, Shunze, Han Feizi, like this, but you have Confucius and Mencius because some Jesuits in the 17th century kind of Latinized the z, so really it's Kongzi and Mengzi, right? And so just
is
master.
Confucius Kong?
Yeah, Kongzi. Yeah, so master Kong. But Confucius is good enough. So so these two students pulled out from the Analects two very I think the central threads, right? And so Mencius draws out the thread of benevolent human nature, right? So what he brings out is about the heart. Human beings are fundamentally good, and their fundamental goodness comes out as children, say, in their relationship to their parents. So from Mencius, Confucianism, Confucius' thinking becomes a matter of developing the heart, of not losing the good heart, because people are fundamentally good. You see this in children. You see how trusting they are. You see they have kind of innocence and purity about them. You want to keep that, and you want to develop that into adult qualities that radiate from those, and you do that by doing well in your fundamental relationships, right? We'll talk more about the fundamental relationships later, but the fundamental relationships are where you as a human being are naturally nestled, right? Your relationship with your parents, your relationship with your siblings, and your wider family, and then later with your children and with your spouse, they're what makes you into who you are, and you can do them well, and you can bring out the latent goodness and develop them in you by practicing those relationships. So for Mencius, it's all about the heart, and is based on this vision that human beings are basically good. And there's something true about that, because most of us, when we look inside and ask ourselves, are we good or bad? Or even when we're accused by other people, we say, no, we're basically good. I didn't mean to do that. And so that Shunze, on the other hand, pulls out another thread, because Shunze is a little bit more hard-nosed than Mencius. Xunzi looks at history, looks around him, and says that, well, on the whole, human nature is pretty terrible, right? We are mean, we are selfish, we are hurtful, and every newspaper confirms it. Every history book confirms it. We're stupid and we're destructive, and so on. So Xunzi. So obviously, then you can't build a social theory on natural human relationships, or you can't count on human nature to do the right thing. So Xunzi builds his entire social thought on the idea of li, and this word li gets translated as ritual, ceremony, propriety, rights. And so what Xunzi says is human nature starts out bad, but you can refashion it by subjecting it to the shaping influence of ritual, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about what ritual might mean for him. But the analogy that comes up is of a craftsman, say of a woodworker, who might take a tree and then shape it. The branch might be straight, but you can curve it by applying steam to it. So there's a certain malleability in what's natural. So just because our basic human nature is pretty awful doesn't mean there's no hope, right? And so for Xunzi, the human work is social soft wiring, right? Or even, so by rituals, he would mean not just like the actual rituals like Thanksgiving, carving the Thanksgiving turkey and Christmas and Valentine's Day, stuff like that, weddings and funerals, but it would be also your daily customs of propriety, like, for example, the handshake, right? So if you imagine, like, having a good handshake takes a lot of practice, and you can learn a lot from a handshake. And sometimes you can agonize about how you shook that person's hand. I gave him a floppy hand, and so so there's a certain handshake. So a thing of how you look at people, how you talk to people. The conversation is highly ritualized. How much should I talk? When should I stop? How do I signal that I want to get in? How do I signal that I've ended? And somebody who's got no sense of social ritual at all doesn't pick those things up, right? Doesn't pick the cues up. But most people do, which is the miracle of it. You could go into a wholly new situation and kind of like pick up the micro rituals without being aware that you're picking them up. So something like sorry. Apologies.
Blackout. It's time for another ritual.
Another ritual. I don't know how to get. Oh, there it goes. Okay.
Ritualistic lighting.
It's going to happen every half hour. So
precision and timing is the key, right?
Yeah. So other forms of ritual would be things like professional ethics, right? Where you go to the doctor and you expect the doctor to behave the way doctors should behave. The doctor should behave to you like a good doctor. You don't expect him to be a perfect human being, but he's got to be a good doctor. You behave to the doctor like a good patient. You do what they want you to. You give them the information that they need, and that kind of social interaction doesn't depend on your knowing the heart of the other person. You don't need to know what that person's interests are, how their family life is, how good they are in private. All you need is that they're a good doctor, and you become a good patient. And and there are kind of complex and subtle rules to those that we're mostly not aware of. You become aware of it when somebody breaks one of them, right? But like the doctor asks an inappropriate question, right? Or you ask an inappropriate question, then suddenly you break the ritual, you break li, the propriety of this. And
we wouldn't need OSHA today if everyone was a good Confucian, right?
Yes, right, exactly. So with Xunzi, because you can't count on the goodness of the heart, society becomes an incredibly intricate web of rituals and propriety behaviors, right? That knit everyone together, but by subjecting them yourself to these things, you might become a better human being. because you become less egoistic, you become less immoderate. You come down a human scale in following this, all these rituals and paying observance to them. So these two threads, I think, obviously they're competing. So the Mencius and Xunzi come from opposite views of human nature, and but maybe not opposite senses of the goal to be reached. Which may be social harmony, which may be a better human being, a social human being who can live with other people.
So does this sense of ritual include anything transcendent? Any kind of religious ritual that would tie one's behavior to something beyond, immediate relationships? Just curious.
It might. It depends on what kind of Confucian you're talking to, right? So that the rituals might serve, national gods or national spirits that have that tie society to something bigger, and give society as a whole a sense of worth and dignity. So it might do that. I don't see it doesn't necessarily exclude, say, religious rituals, which is why that this kind of Confucianism can be taken and transplanted into different environments that is not incompatible with religious life. I think which is why most East Asians can be, say, a Confucian, a Christian, and a Buddhist all at once, right? Yeah, there's no necessary contradiction.
So
but
Confucianism is more of a practical mode of being, social being.
Yeah, I mean, it's very
More so.
practical. It's
Yeah.
very practical. Practical in the sense that something you'll hear often in all Confucian thinkers is that you judge what is distant from what is near at hand, right? And what is near at hand would be things that everyone has. Like, say, you have a body, for example, and your body makes certain demands. Well, the same is going to be true of everyone else. Same is going to be true of characters in Shakespeare or presidents, right? So when you get hungry, when that body gets hungry, you get irritable. So will they, and so you won't think clearly, and so will they, right? So the near at hand becomes a way of, basically your standard for understanding other people, and it basically leads to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or don't do unto others as you wouldn't have them do to you, right? Because you know what affects you, and therefore you know what affects other people, right? And the near at hand would also involve studying very carefully your immediate relationships, the people around you, you and your kids, you and your spouse, you and your parents, especially, because you and your workers and your staff, because with all those people you have kind of intimate and detailed knowledge of how people function. And if you pay attention to that, then that is actually what's going to help you understand people everywhere, including the history books. But if you don't pay attention to, in a way, the learning environment that you're given in your ordinary life, then it's hard to see how you would ever understand something that's distant. So in that sense, it's very practical in that in that the whole teaching comes from the life that you actually live, the life that which is very similar to the life that most people live. For example, most people have parents, and if they don't have parents, they have parent figures. So then that your relationship to parents becomes very fundamental to thinking about who you are and how you behave. It's primary. So Confucianism starts from the things that are primary, never from what's highfalutin.
It seems to call for everyone to develop a kind of heightened consciousness about what they're doing, how they are acting, how they're feeling towards the people around them. Does that, in your mind, have any drawbacks? A heightened consciousness, like hyper awareness of your own internal state and the internal states of the people around you?
I mean,
like a hyper kind of intensity of conscientiousness.
yeah, yeah. I mean, in the drawback might be a state of constant anxiety about whether you're doing the right thing, whether you hurt that person, whether you chose the right words. So one trait of the Confucian is that is a kind of habit of self-reflectiveness, right? And one, I'm tempted to say myself that there's I don't see any drawbacks with being self-reflective. It's a good thing. Everyone needs to cultivate that, right? But a Confucian will tend not to throw themselves mindlessly into an action. Will tend to be very cautious. The caution is a word that comes up often in the Analects, a kind of cautious, mindful, careful approach to human interactions, but also study, learning are words that come up often in there. So this is not like book learning. This is not theoretical learning. This is learning in practice by taking a few things and seeing how they play out in practice and working through it, which means also a habit of self-evaluation, right? Being able to reflect. Did I do okay today? And how did the day go for me? So it's another trait of the Confucian is that kind of self-evaluation, regular. Right? It's like it was a trait of New England Puritan settlers, to the constant scrutiny of the conscience. And there you might say the drawback might be a kind of self-absorption, but I don't think the Confucian is self-absorbed because the work is in relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It seems to me that if everyone in a society is constantly governing themselves, watching over themselves, and aiming towards the maximizing the harmony between relationships, that it would kind of lighten the load, ease the load of a government, and it kind of seamlessly move into political life. The personal is the political, I think, in that way.
Yeah.
It reminds me of what I was reading in book 1 today, that the master, so someone like Confucius, is someone by whose virtue draws out the virtue of other people effortlessly. And so in a way, the master or a virtuous person can kind of encourage virtue in other people without any kind of heavy-handedness. So in a way, I guess my point is just that it seems to me like Confucianism does the work of government. Would you agree?
Yeah, ideally. Yeah. I mean, there's this one kind of major thread that underlies a major, not that I really pull out too many threads, but the key thing underlying like all of Confucianism is this word shao, which is translated as filial piety. And I like to say filiality because filial piety kind of brings up it's from Latin literature, and it conjures up the image of like the Romans worshiping statues of their ancestors, and it's but filiality is not like that. It's not a form of worship necessarily. It can become that, but filiality is so fundamental to East Asian societies, and that does come from Confucius. When you read the records of the historian, you notice that before about 200 BC, the Chinese were not necessarily very filial, right? And so what filiality involves, and just the contrast to say in the West, where I think one of our founding myth is, say, something like Oedipus, where you kill your father, right? You kill your father and become your own father, right? So the self-made man, the self-authoring man, right? It's foundational in Greek myth. And in Greek myth, the response to that is gods who eat their children, right, and stop them from moving on. But you have to be self-made in the West, In filiality is the opposite. It's the recognition that you are not your own origin, right? And so then you say, what does that imply? And so you're indebted to these people, but you're also brought up in their shadow, right? You know them intimately, they know you intimately, you know how to push each other's buttons. It's a very difficult but deep relationship that you have with your parents until eventually they get old and you have to take care of them, right? And so your arc of life with your parents is immensely rich, immensely complex, and in a way inconceivable, right? At any stage, you never know what that relationship is going to bring around the corner. And so filiality is a very deep thing in Confucianism, is that you are bound with these people from day one. And even after they die, you are bound to these people. And in such a way that your happiness is actually dependent on your relationship with them, right? Like if you have terrible relationships with your parents, it's really hard to be happy, no matter how virtuous you are. You know, and I think people who die with people whose parents die in unreconciled to them have a very hard time, you know, and it takes years after your parents die before you even start reckoning with who they were and what influence they have on you. So this is like the filiality acknowledges like the most dominant relationship in your life, and it enables you to inhabit it with intelligence, right? It's the kind of archetype of the filial person is the sage emperor Shun, who was the most filial person conceivable, and his parents were brutes. Like his family tried to murder him several times, but and he's under no illusion about them. And so, but he keeps going back and trying to make them better, and it breaks his heart, of course. You know, so he's got a big heart, and so the Shun becomes the model of the big-hearted person who never gives up on people, and never gives up on those closest to him, and he sticks with it, and learns bit by bit how to not only how to live with them, but how to improve them, how to speak to them. There are hints that his father actually got better towards the end of his life. So, but that skill, the intelligence in living with the social relations that are given to you, living with the people that you did not choose, and working with them, creating harmony from them, that to be able to do that with your parents is the fundamental ability of the statesman, right? Because the statesman's got to work with people who don't agree with him, who are very different from him. So in that way, political sagacity is continuous with filial sagacity, right? You learn how to be intelligent in a relationship with what's given to you. So filiality is so important in Confucianism.
Yeah. Does that also apply to civic relationships outside of family and outside of the civil servant? So like basically your neighbor,
Yeah.
would you still call that filiality, even though there's no blood relationship?
Yeah, to elders, for example, you know, you have a different relationship. There's not filiality with you know, fraternity, you know, with say men your own age, brothers. You have like brotherhood, sisterhoods, spousehoods. Then you yourself become a parent, you know, then you have parenthood, you know, and so you so this web of, I think, a finite number of fundamental relationships becomes crucial for a human being, because that's where we live. And but the filial one is the primary one, right? So Confucianism actually tries to get you focused on doing all those well, without giving you formulas, without giving you rules.
So without giving, like, prescribing ritual.
Yeah, well, at least these books don't. Yeah, these books don't prescribe rituals, you know, and there are cases when Confucius adapts in the Analects. Sometimes he adapts old rituals to present times because those rituals are not appropriate to these times or these people. And so you see him adapting. He also doesn't, the Analects are a collection of fragments. They're a collection of things that he said to someone, not things that he wrote, but things that people remembered that he said to them. And he says different things to different people. There are about 12 main disciples that go through the Analects, and you could weave a life story from the Analects concerning each one of them to get a sense of what kind of character this person was, what kind of intelligence this person has, and you notice that Confucius talks to each one of these differently. There's no prepackaged treatise for all of them. It's always one-on-one. Socrates was the same.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah, it seems to me that based on what you said, there is a common thread running through a lot of these traditions of that time period, and maybe even, later than that, whether it's Christianity, certain aspects of Platonic and Aristotelian ethics, even the ideal that you brought up, one of the threads of Confucianism seems to be similar to what Hobbes said about life is nasty, brutish, short, and mean, and difficult and hard. Do you see Confucius having influence beyond its geographical reach? Was it infectious in that way? Did it spread out?
Yeah, it certainly spread out from China. It spread out from a small part of China, and then it became dominant in the whole of China, which is a vast area. And then you have Korea, Vietnam, Japan. So it spread considerably, and so I think it did have a great reach. I mean, why it didn't take over the West? I think is because we're ingrained in the opposite, kind of like in a way an anti-filial ethos.
Mm-hmm. Well, so we have a question from Randy Paul. He's a viewer tonight. He says, how did Confucius think about elective relationships such as friendship? Relationships you choose as opposed to those that you are born with.
Yeah, good. I mean, good question. I mean, one obvious example of elective relationships that we see in the Analects is the student-teacher relationship. Where you have people who are drawn to a master, to someone who knows, and just wants to hang out with them. And so obviously he would have thought that was a good thing. He himself had people he would choose to hang out with. There were sorry.
With Confucian regularity.
Yes, there's very, very ritualistic talk here. And I wish I could get up with more grace. Yeah. Yeah. So there were bonds of friendship, so especially with friends. I mean, friendship comes up quite a bit in Confucius, and there were bonds, the usual ones, loyalty, goodness of heart, they come up a lot. He doesn't, I don't remember where he directly talks about friendship, but it's there all the time. I don't know if that helps to answer the question.
Yeah. Well, Randy also asks, what did Confucius think about choosing a wife versus having one chosen for you, or a husband? Or
I don't think he said anything about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But there were
those relationships elective, or were they more kind of determined by the family? I don't even know.
It's both. I mean, I think there's both. I mean, you have in the records of the historian, you have marriages that are arranged. You also have marriages and partnerships out of love, right? So I don't think that arranged marriage had become a uniform social custom in the whole of China at this time. And I said it was a motley collection of feudal states, and probably with motley collections of customs. I suspect that in some areas there was polygamy. There was some areas there was polyandry. So it was probably quite varied.
Okay. So I have another question to ask. Speaking of, the central teachings of the Analects, tell us about the concept of Wu Wei, if that's even how you pronounce it.
Wu Wei.
Wu Wei, yeah. That seems to
yeah.
be central.
Well, Wu Wei doesn't occur much in the Analects. It's a Taoist thing. It's mainly a Taoist thing, and Wu Wei literally translated is non-action, and non-action. An example of non-action would be the classic example of non-action would be a master carpenter sawing a piece of wood along the grain. Right. So instead of fighting with a piece of wood, you find the path of least resistance through it. That would be an example of Wu Wei. Setting something up so that setting a system up so that things happen automatically and naturally without struggle. So Wu Wei is like about not asserting yourself against things, not struggling with something. And by the way, Wu Wei in when the Buddhist texts were first translated into Chinese, you had this problem of finding Chinese equivalents for all these Sanskrit words. And you never guess what Chinese phrase translated nirvana. Right? It was Wu Wei.
Oh,
right?
really?
So it was Wu Wei. Yeah. So the first translation of it. And Wu Wei was also, so Adam Smith got the phrase laissez-faire from a French translation of Wu Wei.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's got some interesting history. But with Confucius, it's different because you see the Confucian works. The Confucian works hard. Right. And the Confucian puts himself on the line, puts himself on the table in difficult, ordinary relationships.
That can sometimes go against the grain.
Yeah, sometimes go against the grain. Yeah.
Very arduous. It can be arduous.
Yeah, arduous. And especially if you have to reprimand someone, for example. That's not Wu Wei. I mean, sometimes you have to reprimand people. Sometimes you have to tell your parents that they're wrong. Sometimes you have to tell your leaders that they're wrong. So the Confucian virtue can require struggle. In Shunzi, the soft wiring process that happens in ritual and propriety, that he describes it as that human beings become good through effort, right? And the word he uses is a variation on Wei, right? So it's not Wu Wei, but it's Wei. It's a certain kind of effort. Conscious activity is how it gets translated. Conscious activity, kind of like self-shaping, self-cultivation. Right? So in some ways, those thinkers avoid Wu Wei. It's not Wu Wei. You're hard at work being a better human being.
So we have a question from Brian Wilson. How widespread was ancestor worship as part of customary religious practices prior to Confucius? How much do you feel this influenced his philosophy?
Depends what you call ancestor worship. Right? Is it so is it literally worshiping the ancestors? And I remember when the first Jesuit visited China, Matteo Ricci, around 1600, he eventually became so respected by the Chinese that he was part of the Chinese court. Well, Matteo Ricci was a big defender of the Chinese when he understood, the Chinese were often criticized by the Catholic Church for idolatry with ancestor worship. And Ricci says, no, when the Chinese kind of bring food to shrines of the ancestors, or they sit there and bow there and pray to them, he says, that's no different from Westerners putting flowers on graves. So we don't expect them to be using the flowers and sniffing the flowers, but it's so if there's a way in which ancestor worship can be thought of as like reverence for your ancestors, remembrance of your ancestors, but not worshiping like gods. Yeah, you don't find the latter in Confucius. Like he would never expect the ancestors to do anything for him. Right?
Does filiality continue after death?
Yes.
In other words, okay.
Yes, but filiality in the broader sense, that you know that the family as a whole, your bloodline is your origin, but also filiality doesn't only involve the bloodline. A study of the classics is also filiality, right? The sense that ancient texts might have something to teach you, your culture might have something to teach you. That's also a kind of filiality, kind of respect for something that's old, respect for what went before you.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's a fairly comprehensive idea.
Yeah. And it comes from the idea that you didn't make yourself.
Mm.
You didn't make your body. You didn't make the way you think. You didn't make the language you use. So where does all that come from? And you have to respect it.
And not only are you not your own, but you can't make yourself. You can't. You don't have the resources within you to broaden your own self, right?
Right.
Mm.
Yeah. And respect might not mean mindless adulation. So respect might mean having a kind of critical engagement, critical respect for your ancestors. They were not always right. Like your parents were not always right. Every
So
child.
what's the Chinese word then for filiality?
Xiao.
Xiao. Is it
Xiao.
ZHOU?
XIAO.
XIAO. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we should all learn that as Westerners.
Yeah, our kids should learn that.
Yeah. So Betsy Vandenberg asked this question. Your explanation of Confucian thoughts on relationships, especially familial and those closest to us, reminds me of something that Christian writer and pastor Timothy Keller wrote. Quote, do those closest to you see you changing and becoming better, more considerate, more kind? Unquote. His point being that we should be circumspect, as you mentioned, especially about the way we interact with those we live with. Do you see this correlation, or am I stretching it?
Yeah, you're not stretching it. I think that would easily be a Confucian way of looking at things.
So you could be a Confucian Christian.
Yes.
I like
there are
that.
many Confucian Christians. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, because Confucianism isn't about a creed.
In that way, do you think it reflects Stoicism?
A little bit, like a practical philosophy. Although Stoicism becomes it can be a technique, right? A set of strategies for managing life, for retaining contentment, right? Whereas so the way the Stoic holds his essential self aloof from being moved, being upset by other people, the Confucian is vulnerable. The Confucian gives himself to other people, and he can be hurt, right? It makes himself vulnerable to that. If if one's parents are harsh to one, then it's natural to have one's feelings hurt. And this happens like a few times in Mencius. When Shun's parents tried to kill him, of course he was in the fields weeping. Who wouldn't, right? So it's part of your humanity, because those relationships are important to you.
Yeah, I like that. So the ideal of Confucianism is not some kind of indomitability of self. It's more like letting yourself flow into the larger streams of relationships, right? Something like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, even when they involve struggle. Yeah. So it's like heartfelt, sincere work in your relationships, and not without joy, because they say happiness comes out of that, right? But it's but it is work.
So we have another question from Annalisa Waite. She asks, given the comparisons made to Greek philosophers, did the philosophy of Confucius influence other academic study? Greek philosophy and rhetoric are heavily intertwined, so much so that some believe that a person couldn't truly be virtuous if they were not also proficient in the rhetorical arts. What was the influence of Confucius on other courses of study?
Yeah, wonderful question. So one trait of Confucians is also sensitivity to words. Words comes up a lot in Mencius and Confucius and Xunzi, kind of poetic sensitivity. So Confucians have poems memorized. They know the book of Odes, and they love interpreting. They love chewing on a word, chewing on a phrase, and the beauty of a phrase. So Confucians tend to be poetically sensitive, and to get great enjoyment from words well used. So the book of Odes, which is the first book of poetry in Chinese that supposedly Confucius compiled, they were a few hundred, like 300 classical poems from prehistory that are rich in human emotion and in human situation, but every Confucian would have them memorized and would be able to, the odes would be a world that they would move in with each other. They could allude to it, they could quote them, they could use it, so it's the odes and also the histories, the historical books. Spring and Autumn Annals, for example, every Confucian know the histories would have a vast array of characters to allude to. So yes, cultural refinement, the rhetorical arts, the arts of grammar and rhetoric were kind of an intimate part of the Confucian.
Speaking of Greek philosophy, does Confucianism have the notion of arete, excellence?
Yes, and of course there'll be different words for it. When you study any work in another in a dead language in particular, you'll find that no English word is the exact equivalent to this. Like arete is a good case in point. Is it excellence? Is it virtue? Is it moral virtue? Is it, what is it? And so the words that come up in Confucius are ren, which is gets translated as goodness, sometimes gets translated as benevolence, but the character for that is the radical for a human being with two on it. So there's a certain reciprocity involved in the notion of ren, that person to person, human being to human being. That's what it's about. That's what goodness is rooted in. So that becomes the essence of Mencius. Mencius's view of Confucius is that the goodness of the heart is a kind of ren, a kind of like vulnerability and ability to open up to other human beings, an ability to be moved by human beings, moved by books even, but that ability to be moved is crucial for Confucian. And it's ren also paired with this thing called yi, which gets translated as uprightness, but you might translate it as justice too. So you need a sense of justice, a sense of what's right, but that has to couple with the kind of imaginative sympathy that you have with ren. And so those are the kind of twinned Confucian virtues.
Yeah, it gets more and more comprehensive and profound as we go.
Yeah.
Randy Paul asks again, how do you see the Chinese government using Confucius today to develop a unified Chinese culture?
With Machiavellian cunning. So Confucius became, the way, a way to create harmony, a way to unify people under an understandable ideal, kind of a workable ideal of a human being that, and so the Chinese government obviously has incentive to promote this as a way of being, peacefully with each other. It's not at all incompatible with power politics, but it's hard to see how Confucianism would, as I've described it, would operate on the higher level of power politics, which demands, a certain kind of ruthlessness that you wouldn't necessarily use on your family, right? But Confucianism can become a kind of sheen on a tough society, right? It looks Confucian, but there's a kind of toughness that underlies it.
Yeah, and it's an acknowledgement that you really need both. Any society needs toughness and softness, because I think, and that reflects that tension between the two main disciples of Confucius about human beings being both, on the one hand, good by nature, but also corruptible by nature.
Yeah, yeah,
Mencius,
yeah.
and who was the other one?
Xunzi,
Xunzi.
Xunzi. Yeah, I mean, Annalisa Wait just put it really well, that it's a relational philosophy ultimately, and I think that's exactly right. You know, that we are by nature relational, right? And so that's where our happiness is located, and that's why the Confucian treatment of ethics is so down to earth and you know, and recognizable, unlike something as remote as Platonic forms or Aristotle talking about virtue, or Kant even. It's not abstract like that, which makes them so, like, in a way, like unrelatable. Whereas seeing Confucius and Mencius has a lot. I recommend Mencius strongly. I think you would like Mencius. It's a whole bunch of stories and conversations. And one of the things that keeps coming up in Mencius is, should I accept this gift from this person? So the question of, should I accept this gift? What am I getting myself into? What's a gift like this? It's that kind of question that preoccupies Mencius. It's kind of very daily. How much should I spend on my mother's funeral?
Mm-hmm.
What is the appropriate amount to spend on a funeral? You know, and you find that when you think about these things, there are kind of very deep philosophical questions that exist in, you know, underneath these practical preoccupations.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we have another question from Brian Wilson. You've touched on some of the difference between Taoism and Confucianism. I'm wondering if you can just elaborate on those differences a bit more and maybe point out, and please forgive my limited familiarity with the Eastern classics, Western classics that have similar ideas.
Yeah, well, Nathan in our pre-talk banter brought up, I think, a very good analog to this. Think about, like, the relationship between an Enlightenment, 18th century Enlightenment thinker and a romantic, right? Where you have one that is firmly grounded in a realm of reason and social reasonableness, and the other one that is grounded in a sense in a sense of the extreme, the outrageous, the distant, the foreign, the strange, right? That's the kind of that's good analog to the relationship of Confucianism to Taoism, right? Confucianism, in a way, is so from one perspective, is so mundane in that it's firmly embedded in ordinary relationships, and not in Tristan and Isolde or something like that. You know, so it's not extreme relationships. And Taoism is in a way like antisocial. I'm simplifying it a lot. I'm simplifying, you know, so Taoism can be antisocial, kind of wild. The human being is not fundamentally relational.
Mm. Just like light and dark.
Yeah. Hi, Kevin. So what would Confucius think about the practice of meditation where silence is central? Don't know what he would think about that. I think Mencius at some point does say that the only way to cultivate your inner power, he calls it qi, your vitality, is through doing virtuous actions. So not by exercises, not by meditation. And in fact, there's with when Buddhism comes in, several hundred years after Confucius, actually maybe even like 1,000 years after Confucius, when Buddhism takes hold, there becomes, you see kind of a raging controversy between silent, solitary meditation and social effort, right? And Confucians are divided, you know, all over. There's some that say it's perfectly compatible with being in society, being in relationship, you know, and there are even Buddhists who think that that work with other people is a kind of meditation. You know, it's the mindset with which you practice it. And silent meditation, yeah, as I said, they thought about it, and you can if you read anthologies of Neo-Confucianism, you can see that where they had to reckon with Buddhism. Buddhism is also like, in a way, classical Buddhism is also anti-family, right? And then they saw it as not filial. So Buddhism was a problem for them.
Interesting. Because Buddha himself, I think, renounced his family to kind of enter the service, so to speak. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
So let me ask a question to kind of bring us down the home stretch a bit. How does a 21st century person best approach Confucianism, and what value does Confucianism hold for us today? You mentioned this before about the need for, relational consciousness, but continue.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I think we all see in our lives that we don't really think about our fundamental relations until something goes wrong, right? And we think about them when we're in therapy. And it's the same with, you think about what works in our literature deal with fundamental relationships, and it tends to be novels, right? Novels or even tragedies. The Greek tragedies are all about family, and so those works of our literature approach fundamental relationships when they go horribly wrong, right? So they become interesting for the writer when they are horribly wrong, when you kind of like gone over the edge. Confucianism would be a way to approach it in its normal state, right? Before it goes over the edge or without it going over the edge. So then the question is, what helps us to think about our fundamental relationships before they reach crisis? And when you think about how little we are told about these things, like how, let's say relationships, right? How little we are told about the cycles in which we hate our parents for a long time, or the difficulties we might have as a spouse, or the difficulties we might have as a parent. Generally speaking, no one tells us anything about this, and we're on our own to figure it out until things go wrong. And then you go to therapy and they recommend books, and you find out there are books about these things, and so I think that's a big thing that's missing in our society, is a little bit more personal information, a little bit more personal guidance about cycles in these relationships that we have. In a 10-year cycle, you're going to have periods where you're angry at each other, when you love each other, when you need space from each other, when you need closeness with each other. How do those work? And so instead of when we find ourselves in misery in one of those relationships, we then, because there's no guidance, and because there's no sense of this being normal, then we end up breaking the relationship because of that. We're shooting in the dark. So I think that if there were just more light or more openness about what really goes on in relationship, and that, say, being a good child to a parent, it's a wonderful thing, but it's going to have these difficulties, and other people have these difficulties, and these are ways to solve it. These are how you get better as a child. So approaches like that, I think, would help tremendously. It would be like therapy before therapy, health rather than therapy.
Yes, something that's integrated within the normal, the normal walks and practices of life.
Yeah, it's a relational hygiene.
Do East Asian countries integrate Confucianism within their maybe curriculum or certain kind of cultural rituals?
They have in the curriculum, but mostly it's taught at schools. I mean, taught at home, and everybody does it.
It's like the water they swim in, so to speak.
Yeah, you get guidance from uncles and aunts, and and siblings and cousins.
Okay.
But in our society, we're mostly on our own. I think that's the sad part.
Yeah, that's true. Do you have a favorite saying or passage or cryptic quote from Confucius?
Yeah, it's when Confucius heard the music of Shao, he forgot the taste of meat for 3 months.
Mm,
Yeah.
I'll be thinking about that.
And the thought was he had not known that music could be so beautiful. So his sense of beauty and things explains a lot about Confucius, is that he loved virtue, he loved goodness, and he was entranced by it. So this I think it wasn't dreary work for him. So when he saw someone do something beautiful, it would elevate and entrance him like that, take him out of his body. And I think that kind of lifts this daily work out of just grind, out of just kind of a moral, dutiful grind, into like, you in doing this kind of work, you're in the realm of beauty. And I think that's something that keeps coming up in Confucius. It's beautiful work. It's hard, but it's beautiful.
This is the beauty he's seeing in terms of relational harmony, right?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting to think of the different types of beauty that exist. There's kind of intellectual beauty, beauty of ideas, physical beauty, natural beauty, countless forms of beauty. But this should definitely be kind of a category of beauty that we think about more often, I think.
Yeah.
So last question by Betsy Vandenberg. She asks, do these Confucian ideas, therapy before therapy, about family relationships account for strong family bonds that I notice in East Asia? And are those bonds weakening as modernity and Western ideas take over?
Simple yes to both. Yes. Yeah. I often wonder with my friends in China how they, many of them live with 3 generations under one roof, and the grandparents, the parents, and the children, usually sometimes in a small apartment, with a 2-room apartment, and they appear to be doing it quite harmoniously. And that if we tried it here, within 2 weeks, somebody would die.
Do you think it's right to almost equate modernity with kind of Western notions of individualism?
They're connected. I wouldn't say they equate it, but they're connected.
Overlapping.
Yeah. Overlapping. Yeah.
I think that's true. Yeah. It is.
Yeah.
It's infectious and contagious.
Yeah.
I wonder though if that's behind some of the anxiety that we see in certain Western governments towards the United States, for example. I think there's an anxiety about what unadulterated individual freedom can lead to in a polity.
Right.
And I think we in the West don't appreciate that anxiety perhaps as much as we should.
Yeah. The whole mask debate, I think, showed up a kind of nihilistic individualism, right? I get to do whatever I want. Nobody can tell me what to do.
Mm.
Yeah.
So you don't see that anxiety in East Asia as much, would you say?
Yeah, I think not as much. And it's not just, we paint it as a kind of blind obedience to the government, but I think it's much more than that. I think it's deference to a sense of what the people around you need, what's good for the people around you as a whole.
Mm.
Yeah.
Do you have any last thoughts before we conclude?
No, I just thank you very much for having me again.
Oh, thank you. This has been so illuminating and eye-opening to ask questions, to listen, to think through the implications of this way of thinking, this way of being, this way of relating. It's a kind of discussion that will stick with me, I know, for a long time. And I'm going to keep plowing through my Analects.
Yeah, actually, I will make one book recommendation. This book, Mencius, right, translated by David Hinton. It's a good place to start. It's very entertaining. Good stories. It's beautifully translated.
Would these be the words of Mencius, or
these are the words of Mencius? I think he wrote this. Yeah.
And he's a disciple of.
Yeah, 3rd generation disciple. Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Mencius by David Hinton.
Translated by, yeah.
We will keep that in note. Well, Mr. Venkatesh, thank you very much again. And hopefully we will be in touch and we will see you next time.
Yep. See you next time. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks.